Hii ni Haki FM, Oasis of Justice.
My name is Judy Moraa, and it's now 5 minutes past 9 a.m. Good morning, where you tuned in from the 30th of March 2022. And it's quite unfortunate that this month imeisha tu hivyo. Yani, we are 3 months down the line. Yani 3 months. The year is 3 months old so far. But today I'm extremely excited that I'm not alone in studio. With me, I have an extremely interesting guest that I'd like him to introduce himself. I think I'll not do him enough justice if I introduce him. Welcome.
Sure. Thank you so much. My name is William Aseka. William Aseka is a lawyer by profession. I work at an organization called Validity Foundation. Validity Foundation is an organization that works with people with disabilities. As an organization, we are headquartered in Hungary, Budapest, Hungary, but in Africa, we work in Kenya, Uganda, and Zambia. And mostly what we do is we try to work with organizations of people with disabilities. This includes trying to help them with litigation matters. So, for instance, if there is a certain human rights violation in which they have been subjected to, we help them go to court. If we need to do advocacy work with them, we do advocacy work with them, trying to help them to advocate on certain issues which affect them. Yes.
Thank you so much. But like one of the things you mentioned is, yes, you work with people's organizations that deal with people with disabilities, but your main interest is in mental disability. And this got me thinking, you know, when we talk about mental disability, people just think about madness, yeah? And it's quite unfortunate that that's how people think, but at least you're here, you're going to clarify on that. But as you do that, there's this common trend amongst young people. Nowadays, people are so stressed, but instead of someone telling you, you know, I'm stressed, they'll be like, okay, I'm having a mental breakdown. What can you say about that? Why is someone prescribing madness on themselves?
So there are two things, okay? So number one, with mental disability, so it's a generic term that we tend to use in our organization, but to differentiate between the two by giving examples, it would be easier. So generally, for people with disabilities, especially mental disabilities, there are two categories. There is one in which I usually refer intellectual. Intellectual is the one in which, for instance, if you are to be born today and you take longer to develop certain things. So, for instance, by the time you are reaching, let's assume, age 2 years, there are certain developmental skills that you need to be going on as a child. So, and you see, when you are a parent and you realize that your child is almost 1 year, he's not speaking, you start asking yourself certain questions. So, in medical terms, let's assume maybe the child will be taking longer to develop as a child. So, for instance, you might be having Down syndrome, you might be having autism and all that, these conditions in which someone acquires them when they're still a child. Now, on the other bit of it, it's these ones in which we call psychosocial disabilities, in the sense that these are the ones in which we acquire due to societal pressures. So the ones in which you are referring to, oh, I'm depressed, I have a bipolar, I have, what is this called? PTSD, for instance, for people who are dealing with, maybe they are working in the military and because of certain conditions, or even, for instance, for ladies who, let's assume, they have had an unfortunate event of undergoing rape. So some of them usually have PTSD afterwards, and they need to be cancelled and all that. So for people who self-prescribe themselves, it might be the truth, it might not necessarily be the truth, but the best way to do it is usually to go to a counselor and speak, and then the counselor will be able, and I think we have so many psychologists who can be able to assist with those kind of conditions, especially the ones in which normally you will say that you are stressed because of something.
Yeah, so it is not, like we've just said, it's not proper for you to prescribe something that you do not know. And like, there are so many mental disorders, depression being one of them. But will you be kind enough to just mention a few, and how someone, like, it's not the science aspect of it, and how someone can know okay, just the way like a normal sickness, you'll have a headache and say, okay, let me rush to the hospital. So when it comes to mental disorders, what are these first symptoms that you can see and take yourself to the hospital or to a psychologist?
So most likely, I think from my little bit of experience with it, and I think this is more on the medical side, but from my little bit of experience of it, is that some of the symptoms is that, for instance, if you used to do something quite very well, and then all of a sudden right now, so for instance, I'll give you an example, that if normally I will be driving in Nairobi, and of course driving in Nairobi by itself, it's a chaotic process, and you will not necessarily be, what is this called, triggered or angered by certain things in which people do on the road, and then all of a sudden you start seeing things in which you are angered, you are triggered in the process, and you start reacting angrily on certain things. That is one way in which you can be able to start saying yourself, okay, if let's assume you are doing some work in an office, you're working somewhere, or if you're a student, you are studying somewhere, and normally you will do certain things, and you see some of these things is usually just self-reflection, that at some point I was able to do these things without so much pressure, but right now a little bit of something makes me a little bit of angry. I become very angry. I can't be able to react on certain things and all that. So on that basis, those are some of the triggers in which, but again, for some people, they never realize that. That is the unfortunate bit. They never realize. They just think probably this is part of growing up. And because it's part of growing up, so you leave it very, very late. So for instance, I'll not mention names, but I know of someone who was working in a certain organization for a very long period of time, and I think he had a condition, what is this called? A condition in which he started overreacting to instructions that he was given by his boss. For him, he didn't realize that basically he was getting a mental condition for himself, and I think he realized it later on after he had been sacked. That's when now he started going to hospital, and then he was told probably you will need this kind of medication. So part of it is that people never realize, because you see, it's not like fever in which you can easily say, oh, I'm having fever, and I can be able to go to hospital for that.
Yeah. So I believe like right now you've heard it from the professional himself. So you can talk to me on 0799 387 613. That's our SMS and WhatsApp line. Have you been in that bracket of people prescribing mental disorders on themselves? And if the answer is yes, tell me why you think so. And continue streaming hackifm.or.ke for more.
This is Haki FM, Oasis of Justice.
Every time we talk about mental awareness here and mental disorders and all these things related to the mind, but unfortunately we've never had a professional but today we have one in studio. Welcome back, Aseka.
Sure, thank you so much.
Yeah.
Yes.
And we were talking about the symptoms and why someone should take themselves to the hospital. But before it gets to that, if you let's say you have never gone to the hospital, but you have committed an offense because maybe venye unasema you cannot control your anger. You find that you are not born with this. It's just that as time went by, maybe pressure, yeah, job and all these things, even family, you find yourself in this space. Maybe you hit someone and in the process you killed them. So in this case, when someone has been charged with that offense, they've been taken to court. So how can you be able to argue your case? Can you now say, venye tumezoea kusema, unajua, now when you relate with your peers or someone else, you'll be like, niko na two mental issues. You see, you're just saying things, but you cannot go and tell a judge, I had a mental breakdown when I did that. Or if you can do that, can it be considered Yeah.
Yes, so a couple of things. So number one, once you are a person with disability and you happen, especially with mental disability, and you happen to commit a crime, two things which will follow. So it depends with the type of crime. For those who commit murder, I think you raise, for people who are within the legal profession will already know that even before they take the plea, there is usually what is this called the mental assessment, okay, which is done for them. And I think that is a discussion for another day, but I think it's usually problematic from our angle as an organization. But most people will usually be subjected to that, especially for murder. But if you commit a crime which is not necessarily murder, what is this called? In most cases, you will not be subjected to mental assessment at the start. So what happens sometimes for people with this kind of conditions is that when you are taking the plea, that is when the judge or the magistrate can now see whether you are okay or not okay. So, and you see most of the times if you are not okay, for instance, the very basic questions in which magistrates will ask you, so inasemekana wakati huu na huu ulitenda kitendo hichi na hiki. So in that particular process, if you are quite keen in courts, the magistrate will usually look at the accused person and try to see what are their reactions. Especially, number one, I think for them is usually just to understand that they're not going to say, oh yes, I did it, because you see, if they say yes, I did it, that's a guilty plea, and if it's a guilty plea, therefore it means they need to be sentenced. So most likely the magistrate will usually try to inquire, oh, you did it, do you know the importance, or do you understand the impact of you saying yes, I did it, and all that. So for people with mental disability, some of them at that particular stage, because they might be reacting on certain things, if the magistrate in her or his opinion thinks that probably you need a medical assessment, that is when they'll send you now for medical assessment for offenses which are not necessarily murder. So at that particular stage, it can be determined. So you can go through, I think according to our system, it's a little bit unfortunate for people with mental disabilities. Some will go through without anyone noticing, but some will not go through and they'll be subjected to that particular medical assessment. So with the medical assessment, most likely, depending with the location of where you are being charged. So for instance, if you are outside Nairobi, it most likely you will be subjected to the level 4 hospitals, whereby they have a mental health department in most of them. That's where you'll be told to go. But you see, again, in those particular mental health departments, they do not necessarily have psychiatrists available for them most of the time. So what happens is that you might take longer for your report to come back. So in that particular process, you see, the whole idea about access to justice is that you want it to be timely. Timely in the sense that if you are charged today, within this particular period of time, you need to have known whether you are guilty or not guilty. But you see, if you are subjected to another medical process, it takes a little bit of long of time. So in that basis, they are able now to undergo what is this called access to justice, but at a very long procedure. So on that basis, you have a problem with them having problem accessing justice in a timely manner. Some of them even end up, I think we have always said that if you are charged in court, I think within a certain period of time, your case needs to have been heard and determined. But you see, if you're undergoing a medical process in that particular time, again, your case is taking longer and longer. And I think by the time you're being reintroduced back into the justice system, time has passed. And on that basis, just by looking at time alone, you will find that people with mental disabilities or people who self-prescribe that they have this condition will have a problem. Yes.
Yeah, and talking about self-prescription of mental disability, I believe that most people do this because they think someone that is mentally disabled is going to be given a lesser sentence, or they have the idea that a mental hospital is much better than the prison. Can you clarify on this?
Yes, there's usually that assumption and I think it's usually given on what is this called? I think those of people who have done law will remember that when you are doing criminal law, there is something called insanity defense, that you can always plead insanity. But when you plead insanity, there are two things which will happen to you. One is that if you plead that you did this particular offense because you are insane, what will happen to you is that in the Criminal Procedure Code, Section 162 to 167 of the Criminal Procedure Code now provides what happens to a person who pleads insanity. Okay, and one of the things in which most people never realize is that you will now be sentenced under the president's pleasure. What that simply means is that you will be subjected to sentencing which is indeterminate. So, for instance, if I was to commit a crime under the Sexual Offences Act, okay, the Sexual Offences Act provides certain maximum sentences in which someone can be sentenced. But if you are to say that, oh, I did this particular crime because I was insane, what that simply means is that now, as opposed if you are to be convicted and sentenced to 30 years in prison, what that simply means is that now you'll not be sentenced for 30 years in prison, you'll be sentenced in an indeterminate. So you can actually stay more than 30 years in prison because you are insane. No, so probably let me explain a little bit the rationale behind where this particular presidential pleasure sentencing came. So back in the days during the, what is this called? Because most of our Criminal Procedure Code comes from England. During the King's time, the whole idea about people with disabilities who committed crimes or people with mental disabilities who committed crime, the rationale behind sentencing under the King's pleasure was that you are supposed to be taken into a hospital so that you can recover and do all that. Now, fast forward into our current situation, of which at that particular time that was a better situation for people with disabilities who are facing. But fast forward, there's been so many developments which have come into perspective, one of which is that even Kenya, we have what is this called? We have passed a new constitution which recognizes, prohibits discrimination based on disability. But more importantly is that we want to look at people with disabilities as equal as in equality without people with disability. So if you're to compare a person with disability and a person with disability, they need to be equal before the law. And at that particular, when we look at sentencing under the president's pleasure, therefore you're not being subjected. But you inquired about whether the hospital is better than the prison. I don't think the hospital is better. And I think some time back there was a review by some media stations about the current conditions, especially at Mathare. And it's not necessarily the best place, even though our prisons are also necessarily the best place. But if you're to compare the two, hospital is not necessarily the best place if you are someone who has committed an offense. You probably need to be in prison, serve your sentence, come out. Because in hospital, there's no possibility of you coming out until, quote unquote, you are umepona.
So I'm looking at our WhatsApp and I can see James Yen, Jack is saying, I'm tuned in from Ngong Hill Hotel. Then there's someone, ajatuma jina yake, I'm here if you need me. Tuned in from Nairobi. This is interesting. I'm being empowered with today's discussion. And when you talk to me on 0799387613, remember to tell me where you tuned in, and also remember to tell me your name and all the necessary details. Or if you also have a question, you can also do that on our social media platforms, Haki FM1, that is Twitter. Instagram, you can find us at Haki FM1. Facebook is also Haki FM1. And please do like our Facebook fan page, Haki FM fan page.
This is Haki FM, Oasis of Justice.
We're talking about the way people with disabilities, the word disability itself, they feel like they're discriminated upon. So when it comes to mental disability, is this the case? Because I believe if you tell me you have a mental breakdown, and if I call you mad, you'll take an offense. So if you tell me you have bipolar and I say that you are nuts, then you take offense. So in your field of study and in your advocacy, when it comes to such issues, how do you address them?
Yeah, so see, there is power in how people want to be referred. Okay, so there are people who want to be referred in terms of their disability, and I think it's usually quite important. So one of the things in which happens, especially within the disability movement, is that there are certain terms in which it's generally accepted to be offensive, okay, or derogatory. So what do we mean? So what are some of these terms? So for instance, if you were to call someone mad, okay, that is offensive, because the assumption is that they cannot be able to do any other thing, or they cannot be able to think correctly. That is one word in which. The other word in which is offensive is that I think, which happens to be part of our legal in our legal framework, is imbecile. Okay, if you are to call someone imbecile, they'll feel offended. If you are to call someone of unsound mind, they'll feel offended. So all these particular terms, there are certain terms in which have already been classified to be offensive generally for people with disability. But again, there's also the other bit of it, is that, so what is the correct way of referring to a person with disability? Now, there are different bits of it. The first bit of it is that which comes with, there are certain people who like to be referred, first of all, due to the discrimination in which they have undergone over a period of time. They want to be referred as a person first, and that's why you find we use the term people with disability, person with disability, so that the people first comes before you even get to interact with the disability, because that is how they'll want to be referred. But where does this come from? This comes from you see, within the disability rights movement, there are different models of disability. So one model is the medical model. The medical model here, we are speaking about someone with disability who the medical society has looked at them as the problem, and they want to solve them to fit. So you're being forced to fit within the society. And then there is the social model or the human rights model. The social model now accepts diversity. It looks at people with disability as not necessarily a problem, but society. So how different is this when you're looking at society being disabled? That if I was to come to this particular building and I have crutches, okay, and there's no lift or there's no ramp, okay, for me to be able to access your offices here, I'll require someone. You see, society has already disabled me by not having ramps or crutches for me to be able to access the building. So it's on that basis that we are now referring as the environment being disabled. It makes you not able to access certain things. Same way, if I am blind and I want to read a newspaper and there is no newspaper which is in braille, you see, society has made me not able to read the newspaper. I'm not the problem. Society needs to accommodate me. So that's how you look at it. And that's where now you refer to people with disabilities, that you are a person first, but there's another component which is now making you to be disabled because of. So the most neutral term people usually want to stick on is refer to a person first before you speak about their disability. But on the reverse side of it is that you will find there are other people who, especially here we are speaking about, this is usually quite technical, and I'll try to make it as simple as possible, because you see, there are certain people who now don't have a problem with their disability. Okay, they have looked at it, they have accepted it, and for them their issue is that if you're going to refer to me, just refer to me as I'm a disabled. I don't have a problem with it because that is who I am. So in any such forum, if you're to meet such kind of people, always first of all try to understand, how should I refer to you? It's just the same way if you're to meet Judy, will you want us to refer to you as Miss Judy or Mrs. Judy? You see, some way, in most cases, the neutral term will be MS first before we even start trying to find out and all that. So it's on that basis that sometimes it's usually just okay to ask people how they want to be referred, and someone will tell you this is the best way in which I want to be referred, so that you can move on past that. Yes.
Yeah, there's somewhere when you're talking about the definition of terms, you said unsound mind, like that's offensive too.
Yeah.
But I believe in court, that's the place where people say things as they are. So I think there you should be in a position, maybe let's say you're advocating for someone and you're saying my client was of unsound mind while committing the offense. So in this case, will this particular person that is mentally challenged still feel offended by being termed as a person that is not of sound mind?
So, two things. One in which we need to appreciate is that, number one, our legal system is generally offensive to different groups of people, okay? So, for instance, some time back, and I think it's where we are coming from, I usually give an example that not so many years ago, especially daughters could not inherit from their fathers. And that was the position of the legal system not so many years ago. So if that was the position and it changed, it's the same way in which something in which we have used, especially in the practice of law, a lot. So those of you who have had an opportunity to swear anything called an affidavit, okay? The very first paragraph of an affidavit is usually says, I am so and so of sound mind, blah, 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 blah. Okay? But what have we ever taken an initiative to understand? So what if I say I'm not of sound mind? What does it mean? Okay? And if you just say so and so, and I would like to swear this affidavit, does it change the impact of that particular affidavit? Those are things in which you have never had discussions. But more importantly is that what is the relation between unsoundness of mind to people with disabilities, especially mental disabilities? The relationship, especially with unsoundness of mind, is that people assume that a person of unsound mind cannot wake up in the morning and say that today I don't want to wear this cloth, I want to wear this cloth. Okay? So that you see your capacity to think is not okay. So because your capacity to think is not okay, we want you to be able to, we want to think on your behalf. So that's why in most cases, I think some time back, was it in 2017, I saw a decision of the High Court which simply say that a person of unsound mind cannot give instructions to an advocate. So that simply means that a person with mental disabilities cannot walk to a lawyer and tell a lawyer that I want you to represent me on this matter, because they assume that they cannot think correctly, of which that is very wrong on very many bases. That, number one, you're already denying them the access to justice. And it's in the same way that there are certain lawyers who, whenever they see an affidavit which has been sworn by a person with disability, and for instance, specifically because, for instance, for us, we tell our clients we will not include the word sound mind in that particular affidavit. And there are certain lawyers who will start having a debate as to why is it not included, because that is the procedure of the law. So that particular word is assumed or is associated with people who can't think. And maybe you can ask the listeners in their own local terms, what are some of the terms in which they refer, especially local languages, or how do they refer to mad people, quote unquote. And if you are to get the answers, you'll realize that there are certain words in which, if you are even to be called in your local language, you'll not necessarily be happy. So that is the same way for a person with mental disability who gets to interact with the legal system, which has been made to believe that for you to be a good person, you must think correctly. But you have never defined what is thinking correctly. If I wake up in the morning and I get paid, I work in this organization and I get paid 50,000 Kenya shillings, and I decide, you know what, it's time for me to go to Mombasa and use all my money. Am I thinking correctly? Because society maybe expects me to say, oh, you know, I need to save money, I need to do this, and all that. So what happens? What is this definition? What is the standard of thinking correctly? And all that. So that is the association between unsoundness and why it's usually quite offensive.
Yeah. And talking about the way people want to be addressed, do you believe, or have you ever handled a case where someone committed an offense just because of how they were addressed? Maybe when someone has a mental disability and you're there as a family member, and family members at times, they can be quite brutal. Actually, most bullying starts in the family. Instead of analyzing and understanding your problem, they'll be like, okay, this is just a mad person, you see. And I believe there are some instances where such utterances can cause this person to commit an offense, maybe by they just wanted to slap you or hit you gently or just hit you, then they ended up maybe being charged of assault. Yeah,
so there are a couple of things in which you need to appreciate. So number one, it's let me start by saying no, I've never handled such a case, but let me put it this way, that you see, for people with mental disabilities, there are a couple of things in which you need to appreciate as to why. So as an organization, one of the things in which we are advocating is you're advocating for what is called community-based services. So what are community-based services? Community-based services are services which are easily available at the community for a person with mental disability to access. So that once we identify what is this called, the triggers of you reacting in a certain way, it needs to be corrected by now saying, you know what, if these are the triggers, let's try and avoid it so that everyone lives in a in a community which they are okay, so that they are not able to be subjected to or they are not able to react. But for families which have people with mental disabilities, here are some of the challenges that they usually face. One is that for such a family, number one, if it's a parent, especially for the wives, if it's in the village, most likely the husband will have abandoned them long time ago, so that one is quite okay. That's usually quite common within our society, that if today your wife was to give birth to a child with disability, I think on very few occasions, I think 1 out of 10 cases will the husband remain. Okay? If it was to happen that this person acquired a disability at some point in their life, again, the woman is going to be ostracized and be called that probably this is curses. And it happens in different communities. Okay? So most likely the woman, the mother of the child, is going to be left alone with the child to fend for them. But for those people who are quote unquote mad, whenever they will be somewhere, everyone will run away from them. So that is how society looks at it. So in that particular process, the triggers of them reacting and committing an offense, there are quite many, because number one, everyone wants to be loved. That is the truth of the matter. So, however, what is our condition? We want to feel some love and care. So, if you're not receiving some love and care, most likely you will be reacting to certain things quite a lot. And it's that basis that you will find that people with disabilities, especially mental disabilities, end up committing crimes and end up being arrested and being in the system for very long periods of time.
Hii ni Haki FM, Oasis of Justice.
This is the Law and Justice Show on your number one legal station, Haki FM, Oasis of Justice. Arise and shine. Where are you tuned in from? Remember, you can talk to me on 0799 387 613. That's our SMS and WhatsApp line. You can also talk to us on our social media platforms, Haki FM1, that is Instagram. Then Twitter, it is Haki FM1. But please do not forget to use the hashtag, the Law and Justice Show. And today we are talking about it's more of mental disability awareness, but also in terms of advocacy. So we want to know, like, when someone, when you're saying you're mentally disabled, then from what I have understood so far from our discussions, is a magistrate will not be in a position to convict you. It's left to the president, right?
So I think the magistrate will convict you, but the sentencing is the one
the
which will
sentencing.
be done
Thank
by
you for the
pleasure.
clarification. Yes.
The sentencing. Because you see, once you are convicted of a crime, there's usually a punishment. So maybe let me just go a little bit back, maybe to explain to the listeners that you see, when you are charged, the criminal process begins by you being arrested, in which most people usually know you are arrested, and then you are taken to court. When you are taken to court, you are charged with a certain offense, and then you enter a plea of not guilty or guilty. Okay, so once you enter a plea of not guilty, the case now begins from there, that whoever is accusing you to have done this particular offense now needs to prove that you did it, and the standards of each offense are different. Okay, so at the end of that particular process, now it will be determined whether you have a case to answer or not. And that particular time is whereby you are now required to, what is this called, to defend yourself, or kujitetea in Kiswahili. That those of you who watched Vioja Mahakamani is the typical example of how a criminal case usually goes, that after the prosecution has presented its case, most likely the judge or the magistrate will ask you in very simple terms, unataka kujitetea ukiwa upande gani? Nimesikia malalamishi ya serikali, naona uko na kesi ya kujibu, unataka kujitetea ukiwa upande gani? So hiyo kujitetea ukiwa upande gani ndio determine. So after umejitetea, the court will now go back and say, okay, after having listened to everything, I find you guilty of this offense. So once you are found guilty, now every offense has a punishment. Okay, so the punishment is whether you're going to be sentenced. If you commit this offense, you're supposed to be sentenced for 3 years in prison, 5 years, 10 years, and all that. So for people with mental disability, if you're convicted, okay, it now goes into what was previously section 162 through 167. Here now is whereby you are judged to be guilty but insane. What does guilty but insane mean? Is that you are guilty, yes, in the process, but from the proceedings of the court, it was determined also that you are insane. So when you are determined to be guilty but insane, therefore the magistrate or the judge no longer has the power to sentence you. That power goes to now the president. Okay, the president, as these laws were inherited, now the president is the one who is in charge of sentencing you. What that simply means is that when you are sentenced under the president's pleasure, it now goes ahead that you're going to be taken, number one, the first step, as opposed to you being taken to prison, you're being taken to Madare, okay, for treatment. Madare has a section for, what is this called, the prison wing of Madare. So in most cases, that's where you will be for some time, and then I think when you are judged to be guilty but insane, most of the time you will have found yourself to be at Madare. You will not even necessarily be taken to any other prison to serve your sentence. And once you're in Madare, the only way to get out, it's one, if the power of mercy committee, you see under the executive, they have, what is this called? There's a committee called Power of Mercy, and what that committee sits down, it's they try to see who they can be able to pardon. So for instance, I'm sure you have seen people who were in prison for a long period of time, they had been sentenced for life, and because they were rehabilitated, now they're being pardoned to be reintegrated back to the society. I don't think it has happened to any person with mental disability who was declared guilty but insane. But the Power of Mercy Committee now is the one which is supposed to handle. But you see, this is a committee under the office of the president. How often do they look at these particular things, especially for people with mental disabilities? So in most cases, once you are declared guilty but insane, you end up at Madare. Or if sometimes you end up not Madare, most likely you'll be at committee. I think for people who have interacted with, they usually tell me it's section D, whereby especially on the capital offenses section, that's where you will most likely be. But you see, on the capital offenses section, you see these are people who are serving life/death sentences. Their restriction is quite high as opposed to any other person. So if let's assume your crime was not even murder, you see you are also being subjected to something very different. So it's from that basis that number one, it's problematic that number one is not the judge or the magistrate who heard your case who is going to sentence you. It's someone else. And on that, it's problematic because it's problematic because the hands of the magistrates are tied. And that is where now the problems begin for you, because where do you go? Do you go back to court for resentencing? Because, there's usually an opportunity if you want to appeal and do all that. Sometimes court can review and say, okay, maybe I can be able to sentence you for this particular period of time. This other opportunity that you see even before you are sentenced, there's something called mitigation. Kutoa malalamishi yako. In most cases, in criminal cases, once you are convicted, you'll be given an opportunity to kujitetea. So for instance, most people will say, oh, okay, sawa, nilifanya hii hatia, but naomba koti nisamee, sinipatie kifungo. And then the court will usually say, okay, after listening to your mitigation, this is the opportunity. That does not happen for people with mental disabilities. Once you are declared guilty but insane, there's no mitigation in which you can be able to say. The hands of the court are tied.
Yeah, so from what I'm getting is when it comes to accessing justice, it now becomes a challenge for them. And even from what you're saying about the president or this particular committee giving some offenders that have been sentenced in prison pardon, then it is not applicable to the people that are considered insane. And that is where you come in with advocacy of both people of unsound mind, and these other people should be treated equally
yes.
of the offense they have committed.
Yes. Mm-hmm. So I think maybe to put it this way, so there's a group of people, I think for a very long time, this conversation about Section 162 to 167 has been happening in Kenya. I think there are a number of court decisions which have been tried to handle the issue. I think maybe a little bit of history is that around in 2015 there was a high court judge was it Embu High Court? Yes, Embu High Court. He simply stated that, you know what, I think the place of a person with mental disability is not necessarily in prison but rather at the hospital. Well, I think that was a good starting point, even though it was not the correct, but it was good because one is that we are now we're starting to have conversations. And the most important thing about advocacy is let people speak about some of these issues and the challenges in which a group of society faces. And then fast forward, I think around 2020, a group of prisoners of about, I think, 20 prisoners who had been in prison system for an extremely long period of time. Some of them even couldn't remember. I think some of them had been in prison as early as 1990 for offenses in which they are not, if they had even been convicted, they would have served their sentences and gone back. So they went to court through the help of some of our partners called Justice Defenders. Justice Defenders has a project whereby they train prisoners to be especially on law issues and to be able to appeal. So they got together and went to court and challenged the constitutionality of Section 162 to 167. So early, I think last month in February, Justice Moraa of the High Court here in Nairobi basically ruled or he stated that why Section 162 to 167 is problematic. He gave a number of reasons, but the most important one to start with is that you see in any setting, legal system, we have the three arms of government. We have the judiciary, we have the executive, and we have the legislature. Each of them has its own distinct duty. So, number one, the work of the judiciary is to interpret the law, okay? To tell us what does this law mean. Number two, the work of parliament is to make laws. Okay, if we want a law to be made about certain thing, we go to parliament to tell them. Number three is now the executive. The executive is supposed to implement the law. So one of the reasons why Justice Moraa found Section 162 to 167 problematic is that, number one, it was basically interfering with this principle called separation of powers. That in this particular government, each arm is supposed to do its own work. And if there was interference, they'll be problematic. That you can't go to court and ask a court to implement a certain law. It won't implement. For its work is just to interpret and tell the government, now it's your duty to implement. So when a judge has listened a case and convicted someone, Section 162 was now taking that function, which was still part of the judiciary, to sentence someone and take it to the president. Now you, the president, you can sentence. And that's why it was declared unconstitutional. So that is the first bit as to why it was found problematic.
We've never had any person, like for over years currently, being sentenced to death. So the people with mental disabilities are like an equivalent. They are related to people that have been sentenced to death. And that is why when they're taken to the prisons, they're kept in the same section, right?
Yes, so that is the challenge in which they face, especially, you see now, if you are to go to Mathare Mental Hospital, especially for the prison wing, okay, it's not necessarily a very big place. So what happens is that for those ones who, so I think there's usually more of rotational basis, so that people who come in, go out, come in, go out. But you see, because of mental disability, and I think you see this is now the decision of the prisons department. The prisons department, especially at Committee Maximum Prison, felt that because of people with mental disabilities and their conditions, they need to be in the same wing with capital offenders. Now, whether that is okay or not okay, I think it's more departmental. But what we know for sure is that if you're committed if you are a capital offender, most likely will not have the same kind of rights as people who are not capital offenders. Because number one, if you are to access, I'm sure the timings in which they go in and out are quite different. The kind of rehabilitation in which they are to access is quite different, especially in relation to what is this called, the services in which people who are not capital offenders are able to access. So for instance, I think some of them are allowed to do what is this called, the carpentry within the prison system. I think for capital offenders, that is not something in which it's easily accessible for them. So they must have proved. And you see, when you classify this particular group of people with them, now you are simply mentioning that, you see, for you, even though not yet convicted of murder, you are simply going to be part of this particular group. So it's quite problematic from that particular sense, even from the prison sense. But at the same time, as I mentioned, I think it's problematic for them because what is this called? Accessing justice, which is a fundamental aspect of everybody's life, is now even much more difficult for you to access, because where do you go? Do you apply to the Power of Mercy Committee to say now that, quote unquote, umepona, unataka kurudi kwa society? Or do you go back to the court which convicted you and say that, you know what, I was convicted of this, but I was having an indeterminate sentence, that for you, we don't know how long you will be here until, quote unquote, when we will be happy enough to say umepona.
Yeah, but I believe this type of advocacy has been met with a lot of opposition, definitely, because there are some people that believe let the people of unsound mind be treated differently and people of sound mind be treated differently. So what are some of the challenges that you have experienced so far?
No, so I think generally issues to do so. Generally, advocacy for mental health issues is quite difficult, and I remember this is a conversation in which when we had an opportunity to make a presentation to the health committee at the Senate when the Mental Health Act was being discussed. And one of the things in which we were basically saying is that we need to have a law in which recognizes the capacity of people with mental disability, so that when we have laws in which basically allows people with especially mental disabilities, to be taken to these institutions without timelines as to when they will come out, is problematic in a number of ways. But the opposition, I remember from very senior members of the Senate Health Committee, was that, so you are simply telling us that we need to allow mad people to make decisions about themselves. We will not agree. So that is basically it. And then it goes back to history again. I think I've had meetings whereby I've gone to a meeting of organizations of people with disabilities, okay, and I was trying to make a presentation as to why it's important to have laws which are all inclusive for people with mental disabilities and why it's important. And even among people with disabilities who are not necessarily having mental disabilities, they were opposing it. So for people with mental disabilities, it's usually called, I think I read somewhere where they were referred to be the excluded among the excluded. Okay, so even within the whole community of people with disabilities, they're still not accepted within that community. I'll give you an example. Even if today you are to go to the National Council for Persons with Disabilities, this is a government-owned body. It's supposed to take care of the welfare for people with disabilities generally, but on very few occasions have they come up with programs which target people with mental disabilities. They have all these other wonderful programs for other groups of people with disabilities, especially the physical disabilities. But for people with mental disabilities, no. So there is usually opposition everywhere, not only for people without disabilities, and for people without disabilities, for them, their first point of contact with this quote-unquote mad person is that they're not supposed to be here with us. They're supposed to be in Mathare. That is where we're supposed to take them. So when you tell them that Mathare is not necessarily the best place for them to be, they don't listen to this particular conversation. So there is opposition everywhere, of which I think the good news is that ever since the pandemic began, I think people started appreciating a little bit of mental health issues, that, it can affect anyone, because you see the lockdowns and everything. So all of a sudden, those things in which you used to do, which were to help you cope within the society, you are no longer able to do them. And I think people started having deeper conversation about mental health issues.
Yeah, thank you so much. I'd like to hear your opinion on where do you think people of unsound mind should be serving their sentence. Is it in the mental hospital or is it in the prison? Talk to me on 0799 387 613.
Hii ni Haki FM, Oasis of Justice.
Did you know that if you have sex with a person that is considered of unsound mind, that is an imbecile? It is an offense in Kenya, and it's not just an offense at the offense. You can be imprisoned for up to 14 years. You can imagine 14 years. I didn't know these things exist. And now you cannot argue that this person consent, because the law says that they cannot consent. They are of unsound mind. So how did they consent? Aseka, thank you for joining us, because my people perish because of lack of knowledge. At least here at Haki FM Oasis of Justice, we give you the power of knowledge. So if you know what is right, make sure you do not engage in such things. But now saindo na picture vizuri. I'm assuming you have a relative that is of unsound mind and they're staying at home, because there are people that prefer to take care of them at home rather than the mental institutions. And in this case, it's just like a child. You can leave a child with someone at home and they take advantage. So these people can easily be taken advantage of just because they don't, at that particular moment, they didn't have their sense of reasoning. Yeah, but thank you so much for that.
Yeah, so I think two things. Number one, you see, the law comes, I think, you see, when these laws are made, some of them come from a very good place, but how, again, they're going to be implemented is also problematic. You see, for instance, in our laws, we have made an assumption on different laws that for a certain group of people within our society, they can't be able to consent for certain things. And that is why we are having this discussion that, number one, for people with mental disabilities, they can't consent to do certain things. So, for instance, the one in which we are having a conversation that you can't have sex with someone with mental disability. So, if you are to go under the penal code, which prohibits, which basically provides for certain criminal offenses, Section 146 basically provides, and it, quote unquote, it calls this particular group of people an idiot or imbecile. Okay, and it goes ahead to say that this particular individual cannot consent to have sex. They cannot consent to have carnal knowledge. The law provides for carnal knowledge. So why is that important? That is important because, you see, for sexual offenses, consent is really, really important. How are people convicted of sexual offenses? And most likely because they have not consented. So for people with mental disability, they're still classified in the same situation that they can't consent.
Hii ni Haki FM, Oasis of Justice.
You can see on our WhatsApp, Wolf King is saying, I'm tuned in from Kahawa Stage. Then Alf is saying, I'm tuned in from Thika Road. Big up. Thank you so much for tuning into the show. My name is Judy Moraa, and this is the Law and Justice Show. And you definitely need someone to lean on when it comes to law. And at least today we have a professional with us that is none other but Mr. Aseka. Thank you so much for joining us today. You know, most of the time we are here telling stories, laughing, playing music, giving them a bit of the basics of law.
Yeah.
But at least when we have a professional in studio, they get to now learn the details and the processes of accessing justice. Like we've just discovered right now that when it comes to mental disability, these persons that are considered of unsound mind, when they have committed an offense, when it comes now to accessing justice, it becomes a problem. And it's just a term. Because if you tell someone they'll be sentenced at the president's pleasure, but the president is an executive, like where do they even get the time to analyze cases?
Yes.
Actually, is the president even an advocate or a magistrate? Why is he being given such powers?
So you see, and that's where the problem comes in, that here you are taking someone's opportunity for appeal and to go through that particular process, accessing justice, because you see, maybe you are sentenced or you are convicted and certain bits of these convictions were not necessarily agreeable to you, and you now need to appeal, you need to do ABCD and all that. And you see, your case has already been taken to the president. Or for instance, for this group of people, if you're not with disability and you've been within the system, so you were arrested but you couldn't afford bail, so your case has taken probably 5 years for it to be completed, and then you are being sentenced. Because you're being sentenced, maybe the conviction is supposed to be about for 10 years, but you see, already been in the system for 5 years. Most of the time, magistrates will usually take that into consideration and say, I'm sentencing you to 10 years, but that is inclusive of the time already served. Okay? Yeah. So what is the time served? You've already been into the system for 5 years. So basically you're going to serve an extra 5 years. That, you see, now that is a little bit fair for this particular person, but you see, that is very, very different for a person with mental disability, because you see, maybe you are in the system for 5 years and you're supposed your conviction is for 10 years. Okay, if you're to be convicted of the offense in which you are committed. But you see, you're being sentenced to the president's pleasure. You're being sentenced to where by now this is going to be indeterminate. We don't know when you're going to be out. For some people, you say, but probably tomorrow he'll be fine and then he'll be out. But you see, that is where the problem is. We don't know when you'll be fine, because you see, for the Power of Mercy Committee to get you to be out, a couple of things needs to happen. They need to get a probation department. Probation department needs to go back into your community where you come from to try and inquire whether you can be reintegrated back. But you see, again, if you committed an offense, I come from this community, my village, okay, and they were not necessarily happy because I committed an offense, will they be willing to accept me back? Not necessarily. They'll not be willing to accept me back. And it's on that basis, again, you even have more problems, because let's assume even the Power of Mercy was willing to allow you to be released. Mm-hmm. Where will you go? Your community where you are is no longer accepting you, because most of the times that is what usually happens. For instance, I think I'll give you an example. Sometime back in the news, there was this lady who, I think she killed her kids and everyone. And I think when by the time she was being arrested, everyone in that particular community wanted to basically kill her. And then when she went to court, she was found to be with mental disability and all that. Now she's basically, I think by the time I was meeting her, she was about serving about, was it 10 years into the system. So one of the conversations in which we were basically discussing, it's even if she was to be pardoned, will her community accept her, especially considering the grave of the offense in which she committed within that particular community. And what she mentioned is that even her relatives don't come to visit her in prison. This is the 10th time she's been in the system and she's not being visited. So if such kind of things happen for people with mental disabilities, you realize that the whole idea, as you are saying, access to justice is just but a term for them. They look at it in our law books and say, okay, it's fine, it's there, but I don't think that is really applicable to me.
But don't you think that this is a collective responsibility for everyone? And actually, as a nation, we have failed because we are always told on how the importance of training a child. Then things to do with accessing justice, things to do with mental disabilities, and all of these issues should be incorporated in our syllabus where kids can learn them. Their parents, like right now in the CBC, they are encouraged to do homework with them. So in the process, they can also learn one or two. So in the case of this lady that you're saying, maybe if someone is aware of such issues and they understand that when this person did this, they were not okay, then they will have a soft spot for them when they come back after imprisonment. And it's not even about the people with mental issues alone. They are ex-convicts. When they come back to now the society, when they are free, they're not accepted back into the community. So what will be your recommendation on such issues?
Yeah, so I think it's a collective responsibility for everyone in the society, and for everyone in the society, I mean every stakeholder. So it doesn't necessarily matter whether this particular person was with disability when they went to prison or without disability, but most of the time the challenge is that particular acceptance. And the more we raise awareness about that, you going to prison is not the end of anyone's life. They can still come out of the prison because it's part of, you see, what is this called, the assumption that when you go to prison, I think you see prisons are usually associated with the bad people. And the whole idea about prisons is also to rehabilitate. That I went there being quote unquote this bad person, I've been convicted of a crime, but there are many opportunities in which people come out from there now as better citizens. But that particular raising awareness, the probation department needs to do way much more than it's doing right now in terms of ensuring that there needs to be a mechanism in which when this particular group of people leave prison, they can be able to be accommodated in the society. So that particular process needs to be done much more, and I think there are organizations which are really interested with rehabilitating people who are coming out of prisons. But more importantly, you see, if one organization is doing it, it cannot be as effective. And like if the government was to take up an initiative, the government has enough muscle power to be able to say, you know what, we can be able to take up this initiative to rehabilitate. And more importantly, even within the society, that you should be able to explain to our children that, hey, and I think you see this process begins early. When children do mistakes, you tell them that, you see, this is the punishment for this particular mistake. So they also need to be able to understand that when you commit a crime of which at certain level, they should be able to be told people go to prison, and when they come out, they are serving sentences, and when they come out, they are better people. But that is not necessarily, again, the case for everyone, because there are certain people who, even if they were to come out, again, the society is not willing to accept them that easily, and because of it, now they end up just doing the same prison. So I know of people who will tell you they were very much okay in prison than out because of how the society views them. You see, in prison, there is no judgment as opposed to out here. So if I was to come and tell you that I was in prison for 10 years, already everyone would be like, okay, this is a criminal. How am I supposed to deal with a criminal? Yet maybe I've already been rehabilitated. I've done my time. I've served time. I've already been rehabilitated. I've learned from it. So it's the same situation for people with mental disabilities. When they come out, no one wants to accommodate them again in the society. And that's why you find that this concept of access to justice, that even the Power of Mercy Committee, even if they wanted to do it, they're not being allowed. I mean, they don't have somewhere to go for them to be accommodated within the society. So they end up serving a lot of time as opposed to serving specific time.
Yeah, and I understand that kind of discrimination because I have a cousin that got engaged to someone and they were really in love. They were doing good for themselves. But when a background check was done on this guy, they realized that this guy was once served a sentence for 10 years in prison. So the whole marriage idea just came to an end just because of that. And it's not because that this person is bad. Like our prison facilities are fast correctional facilities. Yeah. That is one thing that people need to understand. So because my cousin herself was not aware about that someone goes to prison to be corrected, she felt as if she is dealing with a criminal. And she doesn't want to find herself in that space. So all the marriage plans ended just because of that. And this is quite unfortunate. And this is what also happens for people that are mentally disabled. And remember when we started, we said a person that is mentally disabled is not necessarily a mad person. It's because maybe they are having some mental disorders. So you find that someone will tell you, hey, you want to get married with someone with bipolar. You are dead. They will kill you. They will do all sorts of things. So what can we do to sensitize the community apart from now maybe advocating for maybe issues about prison and offenses? But what can we do to sensitize the community first?
But I just wanted to say your family is very serious. They do background check on marriages. Anyway, so back to the question. I think the whole idea about sensitization is raising awareness, okay? Mm-hmm. Raising awareness in terms of the challenges that people with disabilities, especially mental disabilities, face within the community. One of the most common things in which people with mental disabilities face is basically institutionalization, whereby we feel that if we have someone within our family who has a mental disability, we want to take them to these institutions where they'll be locked up there. That does not help. Let's be very honest, that does not help. What it simply does is that it continues to trigger them to be much more worse than they were. Studies have shown that when people with mental disabilities live with the community like the rest of us, basically it helps them to recover. Okay, so those particular aspects. And why do you need them to be in the community? So that they can feel to be part of the community. So how do we ensure people with mental disabilities live with us effectively without any problems? Just like I usually say, if today you and me were to be sick of malaria, okay, what will we do? We will walk into a hospital, we'll be diagnosed, given medicine, and told to go home. Okay? Mm-hmm. That is the same way in which we are simply saying that for a person with mental disability, if they have a problem in which has now reoccurred for them, let's try to find as a community, and when I speak as a community, all of us, that let's try and find out, okay, what causes them to react this way, so that we try and provide for those particular triggers, okay? And if those particular triggers for their reactions cannot be controlled, let's ensure that we avoid them as much as possible. And if we can't avoid them, let's ensure that access to the medical services at the community level is a priority, so that everyone can be able to live. And I think for communities, other communities whereby they've been able to live with the society, even people with disabilities themselves will tell you that I'm able to recover much better when I'm within the community and I'm offered enough support. Okay? Because all of us need support. What kind of support? It's very individualistic. That for me, I usually give an example that if today I was to walk into a bank and I want a loan, of course they'll give me so many terms of reference that they want to avoid. But you see, if I don't understand those terms, I can walk to a friend, a family member, ask them, can you explain to me what this means? that is support. Or, better put it, the best support that I usually say, and I think it happens a lot with the ladies, when you wake up in the morning and you want to put on your attire for you to go out, you usually ask someone who is next to you, how do I look? They'll tell you you're looking good, all that. That is support. It might look as a very simple thing, but that is support. Because once someone has told you that that one is okay, you will leave the house confidently. That is the support in which people with mental disabilities require for them to live in the community with all of us. So it's on that basis that let's ensure support is throughout the system.
Yeah, you're talking about the triggers, and I just remembered that just like the chronic diseases that most people have, you realize if you have asthma or if you have pressure, there are certain things you're supposed to avoid, and your community, your family members, your colleagues, they know. So if someone tells you they have a particular mental disorder and maybe something triggers them, so it is up to us that are close to them to understand and make sure that whatever triggers this person, you avoid it. Because I don't believe, as much as we want to call them mad, they just don't wake up and do things. They must be triggered by something, right?
Yes. So someone doesn't just wake up and decide that today I'm going to do this bad thing. Okay? There must be a trigger to it. So the more we understand the triggers, the better, the more we are able to understand. And I think part of for instance, for majority of men, I think the challenge that they usually go, the triggerness is usually to try and make it in society, to be financially stable. And even within our community, our families, that if you're not necessarily financially stable, you are viewed as someone who hasn't made it. And you see, it might look as a very simple thing, but that particular pressure, it mounts and mounts and mounts and mounts. So at some point you start overreacting to certain things. And once you are able for even your family members to be able to appreciate that, you know what, for you not being financially stable is not the end of life. For you not having a job is not the end of life. For you not being able to be this particular person is not the end of life. So on that basis, identification of triggers helps. But more importantly, once we identify the triggers, we shouldn't be too much concerned with, now that we know this is what usually happens to them, therefore we really need to avoid it. Okay? Mm-hmm. Once we identify the triggers, I think over a period of time, most people with mental disabilities end up understanding some of these issues with proper explanation and explaining it to them in a very consistent manner. Because some of them, I think, how we also react, you see, for instance, how do I put it? If today were to walk into your house and find your child has broken the TV, you see how you react to that particular situation is going to also affect how your child is going to react. So if you are to speak with them, it might help and it might assist in terms of them understanding, this one is now wrong. If this situation comes, I probably need to ask for help in such and such a manner. So hopefully over a period of time, I think they'll be able to understand, and once they know the triggers, they'll know that, this one is coming, I need to do this to avoid A, B, C, D. And it's going to be preventive so that we don't need to take people with mental disabilities to the institutions, and these institutions, we know they're being chained. Much more challenges are happening to them in these particular institutions.
Yeah, also I believe the mental health advocates and institutions should maybe do something different, because when they're doing awareness, they'll always be like, depression is real. Okay, all these things, we know they are real. We know these challenges are real. But rather than telling us how depression is real, check on your friends, they should also focus on telling us how these things come about, the triggers, and what to avoid as a society at large. So, and with that, so maybe you can give us a parting shot.
Everyone is equal, and everyone requires support. Today it's me, tomorrow it's you. So let's offer support to each other.
Yeah. And maybe if someone wants to talk to you on the side, where can they find you?
They can reach me on 0721 67 7000, or they can write to us at William@validity.ngo. Yes, william@validity.ngo.
Okay. Continue streaming hackifm.or.ke. So until tomorrow, keep it Haki FM, Oasis of Justice.
Hii ni Haki FM, Oasis of Justice.